I'm going to try to offer what I'm hoping will be some simple frameworks for thinking about and talking about community-owned energy. And maybe also hopefully offer some maybe new ways of talking about it or new ways of thinking about it. But one reason I'm trying to keep it simple is just that the truth is, and what I've learned over the last 7 years, is it's just not simple. Like anybody who's tried to create a community-owned energy project knows how complicated it can be. And so I was just trying to think, can we like strip it down to something that will make it easier for multiple groups to talk to each other, for people across state lines or even across international borders to talk to each other. So yeah, when we first came up with the idea for this event, it was because I knew all the good people were coming into town for the 11th hour event, and I turned to Suba and I said, maybe we can invite some of them over to our office, and then we can close the doors, and then just be like, why? Why is community energy so hard? And we can have like a really honest conversation with each other. In the end, lots of people wanted to have this conversation, so it's great. We could all kind of rack our brains over it together today, and we're also really grateful that 11th Hour has co-sponsored this and provided a little funding so we could fly in some extra people from out of town who you'll meet in just a little bit, and they can share their experiences because they've really done some great work creating community-owned energy projects. So that was kind of the thinking behind all this. So I do know a little bit about what makes community-owned energy really hard, and it reminds me, I was thinking of a metaphor, it's a little like being on one of those cooking shows like Chopped, where they give you 3 ingredients, and then you have the challenge of using those ingredients. Like, your assignment is to go bake a cake, and they're going to give you chocolate, they're going to give you fresh coriander seeds, and, surprise, a sea urchin! Now go bake a cake! And that's kind of like creating a community-owned energy project. And to put it into energy terms, it's like, depending on where you are, there's maybe a narrow securities law exemption that you can use. But then, okay, figure out, are you going to use a feed-in tariff or a net metering thing or some sort of regulatory program that might only be implemented for a limited period of time. And maybe you'll kind of like fit yourself into a weird box so you can get access to the tax credit. And it's so variable based on where you are. And part of the reason I want to have this conversation too is to kind of like push some of this stuff out of the way and to ask, what are we actually talking about with community-owned energy? So that's the situation in which we're operating. And yeah, we've just learned that policy and law have so much to do with whether or not community-owned energy is even viable. And ultimately what we've learned in our research is just that the legal system is really set up, obviously, we know this, to privilege the wealthy, also privilege homeowners in solar development, and just makes community ownership really difficult. But there are groups around the U.S., especially around the world, but even in the U.S., people have managed to create community-owned energy projects. Another thing that helped inspire this event, by the way, was Annie Dillon was at Rocky Mountain Institute last year doing a lot of research on community-owned energy projects, and she created maps or charts of the different financial, governance, electrical flows among various stakeholders that came together to create these projects. And in the handouts, you could see a link to the charts that she created. So I look at something like this and I just think, wow, there are some people out there who are so dedicated that they were able to make something like this, something this complex, happen, which is inspiring on one hand. But it also scares me because when I look at something like this, I think, I don't know if community-owned energy projects can actually emerge from the grassroots if it takes this much, if it's going to be this complicated. And so and that is sort of like the question, it's part of the question for the day, is what can just everyday people do to come together and create community-owned energy. That's why we stuck Grassroots-Led at the front of the title of this event. And so Sustainable Economies Law Center, that's been one of the driving questions of our work, is just what can everyday people in our communities do to come together and create their own sources of housing and food and energy, childcare, and all of their needs. And that's the approach we've taken with many sectors of the economy. But energy is a hard one. But yeah, and of course, I know probably a lot of you saw this week. I mean, this is just more motivating to me to really focus on the grassroots element of community-owned energy. Just the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we really only have about 12 years left, or we're all screwed, basically, is what they said, to really turn climate change around. And so I just think we really have to unleash the power of the grassroots. And so I kind of feel like I've gotten to this point where I'm just not going to be happy until we have models that everyday people can easily pick up and implement. And I also really want to hopefully we can all spread more discontent and unhappiness about the fact that for some people, it's so easy to create and own solar. if you have passively earned investment income, if you're part of that small percentage of the population that has a lot of that, you can use that to invest in solar, and then you can get a tax credit. Oh, and you could also take the depreciation and probably even get a return on your investment. And I'm just like, wow. For wealthy people, that's like, you have your cake, and then you eat it too, and then you eat it again. And it's so easy to use that money to develop solar. And of course, that's the Section 48 solar tax credit, which has really done a lot to drive the development of solar all over the US. But of course, it's doing it in a way that's really tilting the economic benefits toward the wealthy. And of course, that's a failure for justice. But it's a failure for the climate in the sense that it's really leaving behind a lot of people who could be using their personal resources to finance and build solar. All of the people, it's either 50% or 80%, just sort of depending on how you look at it, just people who, they can't put solar on their own roofs. They can't, invest in off-site community-owned solar projects at the moment. And so, yeah, it's a failure for justice and a failure for climate, basically. Sustainable Economies Law Center, just a little bit of background, especially now that Linda's in the room, I'll just share some history, is that we're a 9-year-old organization. We've done work on a lot of sectors of the economy, and Linda Barrera, who's in the room, is actually the founder of our community-owned energy project from about 6 years ago. She came to us and said, well, you're creating community-owned housing, you're creating community-owned food systems, so what about energy? And I was like, okay, fair enough, let's figure this whole energy thing out. And the first thing that we focused on was policy, because we thought policy's everything. It's so big when it comes to community-owned energy. And the first project we got involved in was intervening in a Public Utilities Commission proceeding, because we thought, oh, here's a regulatory program. If we can just sort of make some tweaks to it, we could perhaps have it really prioritize and incentivize community ownership. And we actually teamed up with other groups in the room, I think, like California Environmental Justice Alliance, and then also Vote Solar. And Linda, and then later Subin, filed a lot of briefs and motions and things, basically with this message of we need community-owned energy, like, hey, California, you could benefit so much if you really prioritize community ownership. And the overall response, I would say, to that was just sort of like lackluster on the part of the PUC and policymakers in general, because we've kind of used this same messaging of like, ownership is important. We've used that in multiple proceedings now, or multiple policy contexts. And one of the things that makes it hard, of course, is that policymakers, regulators, they look around California and they're like, well, it sounds nice, but show us what you're talking about. What's this community-owned energy thing? Like, where is it? And then we have to be like, well, use your imagination, because in California, I guess we don't really have a lot of on-the-ground models to point to. So yeah, use your imagination. Maybe think about these groups in Massachusetts or Minnesota. Like, they're doing it, and we could do the same thing if we just change policy or have virtual net metering laws and all of that. But then, in the other states, there's all these other legal issues that are different from here, like securities law. And ultimately, what we realized is just like it's not very effective or strategic to ask regulators and policymakers to imagine something really complicated that does not yet exist in California. So I don't want to say that we got tired of policy work, but honestly, in this case, I think we just kind of got tired of the policy work and realized so much is stacked against us. And we were also just getting desperate. It was like we've been working on this for years and we have practically nothing to show for our work. We were also providing support to various other groups that were trying to create community-owned energy projects, and they kind of fizzled out, which was really unsatisfying. So Subin and I were just like, we can't wait any longer. We actually maybe should just try to create something and be like, how do we crack this nut? How can we create some on-the-ground projects that we can then point to? And maybe later we'll go back to policymakers. We can go back to them later and just say, okay, there it is. This is what we want to create. And then maybe at that point we'd get some traction at the policy level. But in the meantime, we're like, okay, what can we create now? That's the question that's been driving our work. We pitched to the California Energy Commission. They have a funding program. We pitched to them this idea that we wanted to develop out a concept, and they actually gave us funding for it, so that was a miracle. So for the last roughly a year, we've been creating this organization called the People Power Solar Cooperative, and I'm going to just use it as an example throughout, but this is a model that basically we feel could be implemented in California regardless of the policy. It's kind of like policy agnostic. And also across, in other states, maybe even other countries, because the certain basic principles behind it we're hoping could translate well. And so how did we get to the model? And I want to say, like, one of the most insightful things, or the most helpful things that came along was just, it wasn't like us coming up with some sophisticated legal hack, although we tried to do a bunch of that, and maybe we did come up with some clever things. But ultimately what we realized is we kind of need to strip down some of what we were trying to do and kind of let go of some of the expectations we had around community-owned energy and just focus on a few key ingredients, like what is really important here. And, oh yeah, so I used the cake metaphor earlier, talking about how, you know, wealthy have their cake and eat it too, etc. I'm going to use the cake throughout. I was also in bed sick last week, and I was watching the Great British Baking Show, and so that's really influenced the flavor of this presentation. And it also, you know, makes it fun, because you thought, oh, this lawyer is going to go talk to me for like half an hour, this is going to be terrible, so I'm trying to make it less terrible. So it's just time for our cake, our community-owned energy. What does that look like? And I want to kind of put out there, kind of propose, and really very much invite feedback later in the day on what if these were like the 3 rules of cake, which is that the community will bake the cake, eat the cake, and keep the cake. And that sounds very simple, but these are very sophisticated legal concepts, of course, because, you know, democratic and participatory governance has a lot to do with whether the community will truly, genuinely bake the cake, create the energy projects and organizations. Allocation of financial and material benefits really influences whether the community will meaningfully eat the cake. And then just strategies for long-term protection of assets, protecting them from commodification and sale, will determine whether or not the community keeps the cake. So this is serious legal stuff in cake terms. But yeah, focusing on those 3 things, that was kind of one of the aha moments that we had, is realizing, oh, if we just focus on that, there's a lot of powerful stuff we can do and create. And we don't have to create this. This was the crazy thing, is that community-owned energy, this might sound ironic or funny, but it's like we realized it doesn't actually have to literally always be owned and have people get their energy from those energy projects. And that's the wall we were hitting all along, is like, without virtual net metering, how are we going to do this? We realized that is actually of lesser importance. The technicalities of it are less important if we just focus on those other 3 ingredients. And I guess the other insight just related to that is the electrical power that you get from community-owned energy. That's just the tip of the iceberg of the benefits that the community can get overall. And to the extent that our communities are actively engaged in creating the jobs, creating the workforce, creating new enterprises, deciding on the location of energy projects, building public policy, that's the bigger piece maybe that we should really be focusing on. It's the economic and political power that we build for communities while we're building so-called community-owned energy. So the People Power Solar Cooperative, it's really not going to look at all like the rural electric cooperatives that we may be familiar with that are all over the country. And you know, we're hopefully soon going to start building solar projects around the Bay Area, and they will all be very much driven by small local groups that are motivated to build projects. And it's what really differentiates it is that people are not going to be getting involved and joining necessarily for the specific purpose of consuming energy. So the rural electric cooperatives are consumer cooperatives. The main relationship people have with them is consuming energy. So I like to describe this as also a movement cooperative, because people get involved, they might put their financial resources into it, their time into it, and it's serving them because it's creating a platform for them to build a movement and then transform our energy economy. So I describe it as a movement cooperative in addition to its consumer cooperative as well. So I've kind of unpacked the word energy a little bit to say it's not just electricity. It's a lot of things. It's power. But I'll also unpack a couple of the other words I'm using in this phrase because they're kind of complicated. In community-owned energy, the community part, it definitely begs the question of community, like, who is the community? Which community are we talking about? Am I the community? And, you know, if you, like in a very idealistic world, you might say, okay, well, everyone's the community, because if you want literal energy democracy, it means involving everyone and everyone's voice. But then that might kind of miss the point of what a lot of us are trying to do. It's kind of like saying, all lives matter, or, you know, it's like, if you're trying to like get everyone, you're not actually going to get everyone. If you're not actively engaging communities that have been pushed out of the predominant economy or the frontline communities, if you're not actively engaging those communities, they will be left out anyways. They will not be part of the everyone. So, but, you know, the community could also just be like thinking about everyone who's currently excluded from owning energy. It's roughly 50 to 80% of people who can't buy and own solar, particularly in California. So, but I realized maybe the question of who is the community may not matter so much for us, because I think each of our organizations knows who is our community and who we're working with. But maybe what's more important is what's implicit in the word community, or at least what I think of when I hear the word community. You know, I think it's an orientation. It's more of an ethic. It's an orientation toward community benefit as opposed to private benefit. It implies to me inclusivity, accessibility, inviting of participation, openness rather than exclusivity. Yeah, spreading of wealth rather than concentrating it, democratic participation. But that's what I hear. And that's the problem with the word community, is people hear what they want to hear in it. It's very co-optable. And we already hear investor-owned utilities using the word community when talking about things like, you know, situations where ratepayers can pay just a little bit extra and feel like their energy is coming from solar. So yeah, the word community is a little problematic. Ownership is also a real bummer of a word, and I hate to use it because it almost dignifies the whole concept of it, which is a whole made-up concept to begin with. It's fabricated. It's really, ownership is not a thing. It's a bundle of rights and responsibilities, and it's been used. It was sort of created as a tool also, these bundles of rights and responsibilities, as a way to sort of imply that when you quote-unquote own something, then you have the right to exclude others from it, or extract from it, or create scarcities, and then capitalize or profit off of those scarcities. And so ownership's kind of, you know, not my favorite thing, but then using it is also powerful to the extent that we imply that when a community owns something, you get a very different outcome from when a private entity or private individual owns something. Communities manage resources differently. So if we really just focus on what are the rights and responsibilities of ownership, we can kind of break it down to those things. You know, it's like you bake the cake, you have control over it, you eat the cake, you get the financial benefits, and you keep the cake. It's yours. So that brings us back to cake now. Cake is also really helpful for explaining a few legal concepts, which I think get all mushed up, especially by lawyers that don't explain things well. So I use the cake also because, so just also acknowledging community-owned energy. It's a complicated phrase, but we'll just sort of use it for today. And maybe we'll also think about how else would we describe what we're trying to create. There are a couple extra chairs up here if you're brave enough. Actually, there and there.
Someone in the bathroom will take their chair, right?
So I use the cake in part because the base cake, I like to help break down like legal entity and tax status in a way to say like the cake itself it's the entity, it's a choice that you make. Often it's usually under state law, you choose to form an entity at your state level. So it really varies from state to state. Tax status is something generally determined at the federal level. I think of that as the icing on the cake. And so in most states, the entities are called different things, but there's maybe three major categories of them. There are the entities that are designed to benefit the public, entities that are designed to benefit a group of people, the mutual benefit organizations are often called mutual benefit nonprofits or cooperatives, or there's maybe often both types in some states. And then there's entities that are for shareholder profit, they're shareholder owned, and I include in that things like benefit corporations, social purpose corporations, because they are still shareholder owned. So with those three major categories of cake, then you have a lot of different choices of icing, and the reason I break them out too is you can mix and match in all kinds of ways. And I won't go into all of the details of them. I thought about going into them, but I'd be happy to do that in a breakout session actually, because I think a lot about how can energy organizations use these various categories. But I mention these because these are words and things that policymakers understand. These are things described in the law, and if we are going to policymakers and saying, hey, it would be nice if you create a tax credit for people who own energy through a cooperative corporation, taxed under subchapter T, you know, policymakers can hear that and understand it. And so our choices of these things will matter to the extent that we are eventually going to go to policymakers and say, hey, help us out here. This is like the visual inspection of the cake, where somebody standing back, like a policymaker who's distant from it, can sort of like say, okay, let's see what kind of cake this is, and either give it incentives or remove barriers to it. But, and I will say, like, for us, like, to be able to gain policy advantages, I will say policymakers tend to favor entities that are either public or mutual benefit. I mean, favor them if you're going to ask them to sort of create special categories for you, or exemptions or incentives, and then certain types of icing. But we have to bear all of this in mind at the same time that I think to us it actually doesn't matter all that much. Those choices are maybe important to the point that each entity, each tax status comes kind of baked into it, certain rules about how you operate, whether or not you are democratically controlled, how your assets are dedicated to public benefit or mutual benefit. But you can really take any entity and bake all of this in to the legal documents, to the way it operates, to its governance policies, financial policies. So what really matters to us, i.e., well, us, the community, and then all the people who will hopefully be engaging in community on energy projects, it's the ingredients. And the ingredients you add on to that, like your strategies for community engagement, your ways of communicating, your just kind of everything. That's the thing that's like, that's what makes the cake taste good to people or not. Yeah, so that's where I'm gonna like talk a little bit more about what those ingredients are and how they make a difference. So back to these three principles. So baking the cake. Baking the cake means that, the community's involved in like creating community-owned solar projects, but also instigating, initiating all kinds of other things, hopefully, like storage projects and new infrastructure, workforce training programs, just that the community is involved in initiating a lot of these things more. So I'm going to break it down into maybe just three important concepts, potentially. One is that democratic control is really important. Because if at the end of the day, a community of engaged members has control over something, and they can vote, they can run for the board, they elect the board, they can vote on major decisions, it's really powerful and it keeps things from really going astray. And I recommend, it's in the handouts, I link to it, this really short film, you could watch it about, I think it's about 15 minutes, about the Choctaw Electric Cooperative in Oklahoma. It's a crazy story. Like the co-op members were wondering why they had the highest electrical bills in the state, and then they came to realize that there was all this corruption at the level of the board and the CEO. And then it took them a long time. They used their bylaws though. They used their actual democratic structure to regain control and oust the board and oust the CEO. But if they were not democratically controlled, they'd just be stuck paying high bills to some corrupt corporation. So the democratic control, really important. But the democratic control is really not enough. It's a very, it's like very light touch of engagement. People maybe vote every other year. So being decentralized, having projects, initiatives, things just emerge from the grassroots, from the ground up, that most of what happens in these organizations is kind of initiated by small groups of people. Another word for this is polycentric. It's a big sounding word, but it's a word I've seen a lot in the literature. But yeah, the English translation of that is just creating many centers of power, because that's where the community is more meaningfully going to bake the cake. And that has a lot of implications for just, strategies for community engagement and so on. And I also, polycentricity is the word that Elinor Ostrom, our Nobel Prize-winning economist, used when she was looking at commons around the world and saying, what makes this work, or what makes this sustainable or equitable? And polycentricity is really necessary to so many of the principles that she found to be core to meaningful and sustainable management of the commons. So the third principle is worker-centeredness. I don't know, that might not be the best way to say it, but what I'm trying to say is that creating a workforce that is really oriented to toward the benefit of the community, and also highly responsive to the needs and the ideas of the community. And the reason I think that's important is because energy is so boring. Like, I don't think anybody really, does the community really want to be thinking about what makes their light turn on, and do they really want to be that actively involved? Not super active. They want to have influence. But who does really care about doing this stuff on a day-to-day basis is the workers, because they live it, they breathe it, they dig it, And to the extent that that's a workforce that's highly responsive in communication with, collaborating with, organizing with community members, then it's the instrument, or it's the way in which the community can make its voice, its power operational, is the workforce. So that has, I think of the new workforce for community energy is kind of like being trustees. So these are not just, workers who are like, this is just my job, but who sort of hold the expertise, hold the labor in trust for the benefit of the community. And what it means is I think we really need to rethink a lot of common workplace structures, the conventional hierarchical chains of command that we're all very used to, but it's like, this is a structure that's responsive to bosses, owner, and manager types, less responsive to the community. And so if we break out power structures and really give each worker a lot more agency, a lot more voice, a lot more ability to listen to the community and say, here's what I'm hearing, I want to take action, so responsiveness, then you really need to give each worker a lot more power. So, I don't know, I told you this is going to be simple. I'm going to make everything really simple today, but I have to be honest, that's not simple at all, because it's really about saying, like, well, we really need to rethink all power structures. We need to be thinking about anti-oppression. We need to think about workplace dynamics. We need to think about a lot of things. But we'll all be better off for it. So that's baking the cake and the 3 principles. So how are we sort of putting this into play in People Power Solar Cooperative? So we are creating an organizational umbrella where it's kind of like the nonprofit fiscal sponsorship model, where many groups can basically create many small cooperatives under the umbrella of a larger cooperative. So it's that nested, polycentric structure that I was describing. If a group of people comes together, gets involved in one project, they're involved in governing that project, but they also become voting members of the larger cooperative, so that holds it to the broad base of democratic control. So the cooperative is providing the legal and the technical administrative support, where community groups are taking the initiative around finding sites and building projects. And it positions the workers, here's the 6 of us who are involved in it, it positions the workers of being in service to that community. And we're building up our expertise and basically, studying the cookbook for community-owned energy. Shout out to Al Weinreb, the editor of this book. And also, I think there are a lot of people in the room who wrote chapters of this book, the Energy Democracy book, y'all. It's really good. It really is good.
I have copies, by the way.
Yes, thank you.
And I'm willing to autograph.
So yes, we took this just for you, Al. No, that's not true, but I mean, we're really like the workers in this cooperative. The idea is that we would be building up a workforce that's in direct service to the community, and really like it would be the role of the workers to say, hey community, here's a securities exemption you could use, or here's an opportunity to get financing or to use the tax credit, because everyday community members aren't going to be thinking about all of these things. So that's how we're implementing the community baking cake in our co-ops. So the eating of the cake, 3 principles involved in that, or 3 main ingredients. One is that capital should get less of the cake. As I've acknowledged, so many of the financial benefits of energy, solar energy, are going to people simply on the basis that those people provided financing. So we have to tip the balance, enable, receive capital that's going to have a capped, fixed, small-ish, reasonable return, so that more of the financial benefits stay with the community. The financial benefits could be in the form of bill credits, lower cost energy, but also just lower cost food, lower cost everything. It just means energy is going to be lower cost in general. And capital, though, is probably always going to get rewarded unless we really change our culture. And so if we are providing a return on capital, what would be really nice is that the community is also getting that return. So giving everybody the opportunity to take part in capitalizing community-owned solar is really important. So, and of course there's this huge divestment movement, divest from fossil fuels, divest from all stupid extractive things, which means there's a lot of money in Wall Street that's got to come out. And once you take it out, it's like, okay, especially if you're an average person and securities laws are not very friendly to giving you many options, then it's like, okay, where do I put this money now? And I think our community-owned energy projects, particularly to the extent that they're structured as co-ops and nonprofits, which have a lot of securities, opportunities, and exemptions across the U.S., will allow community members, everyday people, to put their money into community energy. So for the People Power Solar Cooperative, Our first project's just on the roof of a house of a local environmental justice, social justice leader, Laura Jo Fu. And we have a team of wonderful people who've been working with us to kind of think through all the details of it and organize. And the model is that anybody in the community can buy a share, a membership share of the cooperative from anywhere from $100 to $1,000. Even that is out of reach for some people, though, we acknowledge. So we're still thinking through that. But we're trying to make it as accessible to as many people as possible. And then the people who put their money in are going to get a return of roughly 2 to 3%. Little like a savings account, maybe a little bit better than a savings account. But yeah, it's like the cooperative builds a solar project, Laura Jo Fu pays her bills to the cooperative, and then the cooperative is going to distribute dividends to the community. And then the third part of the community eating cake, it's not all about the numbers and the finances. It's also just about all of the measurable and immeasurable material benefits that flow to the community, which if the community is baking the cake, the community is probably going to be managing the flow of these benefits of just like who gets the jobs, where do you put the projects, and so on. So with People Power Solar Cooperative, one of the ways in which we're trying to sort of build up material benefits for the community is just having many projects under one umbrella starts to build aggregated people power, aggregated buying power, lower costs. So building one project is not going to feel like it's revolutionary. But when we have more projects, it means we can start doing community scale planning. We could start creating workforce development programs and so on. Last concept, keeping the cake. This was the cartoon that I was the most excited about drawing. I don't know why. It just got in my head. Because I picture, well, this is how I literally picture our economic system. Is just that everything gets so swallowed up and privatized. Essential resources, the ones that we rely on for survival, like water around the world, is even being privatized. And it's so easy for big money, big money is becoming more and more concentrated to just come and swallow everything up. And so you build community-owned solar, you can still imagine a big corporation could come and say, hey, we can help you with that, you all are working so hard to manage it. Why don't we just take that off your hands? We'll manage it for you. Here's $10 million, and then you won't have to worry. So you can imagine how things can get commodified, privatized very easily. So you got to build the protections around it, so it can't just get swallowed up. So 3 more little principles for that. Legal protection of assets, just building in where we can. Provisions in our bylaws and our legal structures, options to purchase, various things that are basically going to prevent the sale of these assets and also create other options, a network of entities that will be there to hold and protect those assets, enforce the protection of them over time. Lots to say about that, but I won't. Another is disconnecting ownership of land from ownership of energy. And I worry so much about how concentrated land ownership is becoming so quickly. Obviously, we're trying to do something about that. But what if we can't? And in the meantime, land ownership already is concentrated. 60% of us in Oakland are renters. And so if we go with an assumption that rooftop solar, especially, is always going to be owned by whoever owns the land underneath, then we're always going to have concentrated ownership of energy. So we have to disconnect them. And it means basically that our community-owned energy projects are going to need to hold, I don't know what we should call it, solar access rights, roof rights, solar rights. It's kind of like oil and gas rights that fracking companies have bought up underneath people's homes all over, New York and Pennsylvania. Similarly, the community, the public, I don't know who, needs to hold these roof rights as a commons, and especially if we only have until 2030 to turn climate change around, and it's like we need to make full use of the rooftops in our communities. Gopal Dayaneni of Movement Generation, by the way, he said, we should actually use eminent domain for this and basically go to all rooftop owners and say you have 2 choices. You either build solar or you give your roof rights or your solar rights to a commons organization or to the public so someone else can put the solar there. Yeah, but lastly, I want to say all these legal protections, they're really not worth a whole lot if there is not a strong, resourced, well-networked community to protect them and enforce them. So I think at the end of the day, what we really need is a very strong movement and a lot of backbone support organizations. And as we started to look at, the history of cooperatives in the United States, where there's a really robust cooperative sector, there's the rural electric cooperatives, there's credit unions, food cooperatives, they all have really strong support support organizations that help finance them, that provide the technical support, that in some cases regulate them. And then if you look around the world, in countries where there is a strong community-owned energy sector, Denmark, Germany, there's a growing one in Australia, there's Belgium, there's always backbone organizations, really strong organizations that bring all of these projects together, community-owned energy cooperatives, and provide a lot of support to them. In the United States, I feel like we still lack that, even though there are groups in the room who are building that up now. I just think we really need to be thinking about how can we do that at the national level. And of course, the things Subin mentioned earlier about the Energy Justice Institute could hopefully be that, to provide best practices, technical support. Our People Power Solar Cooperative is trying to be a legal umbrella or fiscal sponsor to many small projects. And of course, we are going to hear soon about the National Solar Fund, and then about cooperative energy futures and co-op power. Similarly, they are like backbone organizations, especially in their regions. But one of the really key things is that when we have really strong backbone organizations, it really can anchor the protection of the assets and prevent their sale. So I don't know, I told you this would be simple, and I know that it's not. It's nine ingredients, and so I would love feedback on this. And we can, discuss it today and think about, does this apply? Is this something we should prioritize, or how can we better articulate these things? But just to kind of sum it up really briefly, community-owned energy is really hard to do. Policy makes it very hard. Changing policy is very hard. So we need to create things now that are kind of, agnostic to whatever policies we're dealing with. And I think the reality is we can create a lot of things now if we're building organizations that implement these things and that are building up an entire energy economy in ways that allow the community to bake the cake, eat the cake, and keep the cake. So I'm really excited that I just got to say all of this to y'all in the room, because I think you are the ones who are creating that backbone infrastructure, and that the more that we collaborate and learn from each other, I think the stronger we will be and able to be that support to a growing community energy sector. So that's what the rest of our day is about. Now we get to learn about models after we take a break. Thank you.